All right, everybody, we are moving on to chapter 5, the integumentary system. And you can see here we're going to be talking about the skin, but we're also going to be talking about the hair and nails as well, because those all make up our integumentary system. So, as I just said, the main organ, our primary organ of this system is going to be the skin, which is also known as our cutaneous membrane. We group glands in with the skin because our glands are a special type of epithelial tissue. And then we have our hair and our nails that we'll talk about. We consider those our accessory structures. So our skin is our primary organ of this system, and then the glands, our hair, our nails, those are all accessory structures. So one of the main functions is going to be protection. So we protect our skin against UV light. We do that with melanin, that pigment. Our microorganisms landing on the surface of the skin, we're going to try to keep those out. It's going to prevent water loss. We'll talk about how the different layers of the skin help us do that. We have a whole lot of layers of epithelial cells at the top of our skin because it helps protect against abrasion. And then self-defense is one that you may not have thought of, but you could use your nails for defense if you need to. A lot of our receptors for different sensations are located within the epidermis and the dermis. And so it's kind of important to point out that all of our different sensations, whether it be temperature, light touch, pressure, vibration, pain, hair moving, all of those different sensations have their own unique receptor that only detects that specific thing. Sometimes maybe one or two things, but they all have their own specific sensation that they're in charge of. We'll talk about some temperature regulation. We've talked about this with our negative feedback loop some already with sweat, but we'll also talk about how we can dilate or constrict our blood vessels near the surface of the skin to also help us with temperature regulation. Vitamin D production. So vitamin D, you'll hear that in multiple systems, and it needs UV light to stimulate one of the precursors to help us activate vitamin D. So for our bodies to utilize vitamin D, there's a few different steps in the pathway, and one of those steps is exposure to UV light. So we need sunlight or that UV exposure for us to be able to utilize vitamin D in our gut. And then excretion. Under normal conditions, only a small amount of waste products will be eliminated in sweat. In certain body conditions that we'll talk about, you can have some other wastes or appearance to the skin based on the diagnosis. But under normal conditions, only a little bit of waste is going to be eliminated. So when we say the skin, what we're really referring to is our epidermis and the dermis. So you'll see we really group our cross section here into three layers. We have our epidermis, which is our stratified squamous epithelium. We have our dermis, which is made up of connective tissue. And then down here, we have our subcutaneous tissue or our hypodermis. And that uh, subcutaneous layer, the hypodermis, is not considered part of the skin. So we underline that here. Not part of the skin. It's loose connective tissue, mostly adipose, and our areolar tissue that's just connecting our skin to the underlying structures. Our epidermis is our stratified squamous epithelium, so we know that means there's a lot of layers of flatter cells, and we'll talk about those layers more in depth later on here. We have a whole bunch of layers because it's there for protection. If we bump into something or if we scratch, get a cut, some of those layers are lost and we can build them back up. The dermis is what contains most of our structures. It's the thickest layer here, so it's really giving most of the strength to our skin. You can see we have blood vessels in the dermis, and we have a lot of other structures that are also located in the dermis. All right, we'll talk about the epidermis first. So that's this whole chunk here, and you can see the cells down lower look a lot different than our upper layer, and we'll talk about that when we actually get into our different layers of the epidermis. But it's important to know that the epidermis is avascular. So if something is vascular, and we have a lot of blood supply, if something is avascular, it does not have a good blood supply. And so it's relying on diffusion from capillaries in this dermal layer. So if we go back up here, we have our blood vessels down here and up here at the top portion of the dermis. So our epidermis is relying on those capillaries being able to provide them with nutrients. Our epithelial cells are called strata when they're organized into these layers like this. And you'll see when we talk about skin, we're either going to have 4 or 5 layers, depending on whether it's thinner skin or thicker skin. This very bottom portion of the epidermis is the basement membrane, and that's where it's going to kind of connect or the borderline of where the dermis is going to begin. One other thing that I'll point out here is that you'll see that our epidermis isn't just a flat layer right on top of our dermis. We have kind of these hills of the dermis, and so our epidermis and dermis almost fit together like a puzzle piece. And so these hills or bumps are kind of called papilla or papillae if we're talking about multiple. So that's how our epidermis and dermis make a strong connection. Some of the different cell types we'll find in the epidermis. The first one is keratinocytes. And so these, we have a lot of keratinocytes in our epidermal layer. And so they produce keratin, and that provides strength. And it also helps start forming a little bit of a barrier to prevent water loss. And so the cells, especially in our upper layers, are going to be filled with keratin, and that's part of what makes them stronger and more protective. So we'll talk about that process in a little bit. Our melanocytes produce melanin, and so that's the pigment. It's a black-brown pigment that's going to contribute to skin color. And so the melanin that's being produced by those melanocytes is going to change the appearance of our skin. And so everyone has about the same number of melanocytes. So it's really how active or responsive they are to the UV light that determines how much melanin your body is going to produce. So someone with fairer skin, their melanocytes are less active. They produce less melanin in response to UV radiation. And someone with darker skin, their melanocytes are much more active. They're producing higher amounts of melanin. And so even though we have the same number of melanocytes, we have different amounts of melanin. And really, the purpose of these cells and the pigment is to protect the underlying layers from UV radiation. So it's a give and take. So we need UV light stimulation for stuff like vitamin D, but we also, if we get too much UV light stimulation or radiation, we know we can have damage to DNA, which can cause stuff like skin cancer. So that's why we try to protect ourselves some. Our Langerhans cells, all we need to know is that they're part of the immune system. So they're part of what are trying to help keep those microorganisms and other things out that shouldn't get farther into the body. And then one of our mechanoreceptors that we'll talk about briefly is our Merkel cells. And so we have a lot of these because they detect our light touch. So if you just lightly touch the skin, and superficial pressure. So it makes sense if they detect superficial pressure that we're going to find them in the epidermal layer, which is the top portion. Okay, so let's talk about this keratinization process. So keratin is a really hard substance. You may have heard of it before because it's common in skin and hair and nail products because it's good for the health of your skin, hair, and nails. And so we'll talk about these different layers here in a second, but long story short, our bottom layer is where our cells are dividing, and then they're pushing our cells up. Once we get to this middle layer, we start to see more keratinocytes, and so they're producing more keratin and starting to fill our epithelial cells. And so they're going to fill with more and more keratin as they get towards the top layers. And so they're also, you can notice, have no nuclei at this point, so they're dead cells. They're just filled with keratin. And this is what's going to form that tough protective layer, and it also forms a little bit of a barrier against water loss. So the process of this we call keratinization. So the cells that produce keratin are your keratinocytes. This whole process of the cells filling with keratin is keratinization. Okay, so like I said, we have 4 or 5 layers depending on whether we have thicker or thinner skin. So this stratum lucidum, this fourth layer, this green layer here, we only find this in thick skin. So I'll show you a comparison in another slide or two that shows when this is there versus when this is absent. And one kind of saying, just so you can remember the starting letters for each layer, is can Lucy give some blood? So corneum, lucidum, granulosum, spinosum, basale. So you got to remember which order you're going in. So this one's going from top to bottom. All right, we're going to go bottom to top, going back up, starting with the stratum basale. And so that's our bottom layer. You can see it's connected to our basement membrane. That's the border of the bottom of the epidermis. So if you think in your head what would be down here in this white space, you should be saying the dermis. We have our hemidesmosome. Remember that connects a cell to the basement membrane. We have our desmosomes connecting our cells here. So that's a little review from our previous chapter. And so we still have our nuclei down here because this is a high mitotic area. We have a lot of cell division going on about every 19 to 20 days. And so all of our basal cells divide. One of them stays in the basal layer, the other one starts to migrate up to the top layers. Our next one is the stratum spinosum. And so this is going to have about 8 to 10 layers. Let me say this again before I move on. Keep in mind, these ones down here are more cuboidal or columnar shaped. And even though these ones at the bottom layer look more cuboidal or columnar, this is stratified squamous epithelium. So it's going to flatten out towards the top. Okay, so we have 8 to 10 layers, and this is where they're going to start to flatten out a little bit as they're getting pushed upwards by the other cells. It's going to start to produce these lipid-filled lamellar bodies. So that's what they're pointing to in these cells. And so these are little, you can think of them as organelles that are filled with fat. And so that's how we're going to just kind of be able to send some of our nutrients up to these higher layers. And they're also going to start to have some keratin fibers. This is the first place that we see keratin pop up. The stratum granulosum has a little bit less layers, 2 to 5 in this one, and you can see they're really starting to flatten out more now. They're kind of more of a diamond shape, and this is where our cells are filling with enough keratin that they're going to begin to die. So if you're looking at this under the microscope, this is where you can start to see the total number of nuclei thin out. They're going to continue to produce those lipids, and these lipids are not the same as the lamellar bodies that are going to deliver nutrients, but these are going to start to form that waterproof barrier. Think back to our cell membrane, our phospholipid bilayer that made a good barrier. Same idea here. We're going to produce a lipid layer that's going to try to form a barrier against water loss. Okay, this stratum lucidum, this is our one that's only found in thick skin. At this point, pretty much all of our cells are going to be dead. There's no nuclei at all remaining, and they're fully filled with keratin. And so this is a pretty clear zone, we say, because it's full of keratin. And then our last one is our stratum corneum. This is obviously the most superficial. This is going to have the most layers by far. There's still going to be our dead um, squamous keratinocytes. They're fully filled with keratin. And so these are obviously going to be protective because we have a lot of layers and they're also filled with keratin, so they're a little stronger than our cells below. Okay, so this is the difference in thick versus thin as we're looking at it on the microscope. So we have our stratum corneum. We said that has our most layers. You can see almost zero nuclei because this is all filled with keratin. Here's our stratum lucidum. Again, no nuclei, all dead and filled with keratin. Our stratum granulosum, stratum spinosum. Now we see plenty of nuclei back. We see a couple here in the granulosum, but a lot in the spinosum and a lot in the basale. So all five layers there. Oops, sorry guys. So this is going to find are areas that obviously we have a lot of abrasion, a lot of contact because we need extra thick skin. So a great example of this would be the palms of our hand, fingertips, soles of our feet. So, if you go to the gym and you're lifting weights, or if you're working with your hands outside, your skin gets thicker, you get calluses on your hand to help protect your skin. In our thin skin, we just have the stratum corneum and it transitions right to the granulosum, and then we get still the spinosum and basale. And so, like I said, take note of having the nuclei in these lower layers, especially the basale where they're still dividing. And then this is a really good one. You can see zero and they're fully filled with keratin. You can't see any staining. It's just all keratin fibers. This one shows those papilla again of the dermis. So how we're connecting there with those little hills. And then think to yourself, what would we call this membrane or border that I'm drawing with my cursor here? And so that would be our basement membrane. So the stratum basale is connected to the basement membrane. And remember, that's with a hemidesmosome. So keep reminding yourself of that kind of stuff as you're going through your lectures. So one of the advantages of having thinner skin is that it's going to be a little more flexible than our thick skin. If you kind of just like kind of pull on the skin on the back of your forearm compared to trying to pull on the skin of your palm, you can feel that your palm has much thicker or tougher skin. And so this is going to cover most of our body, and it's a thinner layer of skin because that's what's going to have our hair growth. So our thicker layers of skin tend to have no hair growth. All right, we've talked about skin color a little bit already. The primary contribution is from melanin. And so we said this is produced in response to UV light. It's typically a brown or black, but there's also a yellow or reddish tint to certain types of melanin. Carotene, think of a carrot. It's that yellow-orange pigment that tends to come from vegetables. If you ate a ridiculous amount of carrots, your skin would have more of an orange-yellow tint to it than usual. If you don't have good blood flow, say someone's anemic or they have blood flow issues, typically that area of the body or all of their skin is going to look very pale, and that's because they're not getting as much of a reddish tint from our hemoglobin. So when we say hemoglobin, we're usually referring to its ability to carry oxygen throughout our body, but it also has a reddish hue that gives our skin some color. You'll also notice that the thicker areas of skin are a little more yellowish. So a callus or like a corn on a foot tends to have a yellowish tone to it compared to the skin, our normal skin color. So that's something else that can affect skin. A couple of other things that I can think of that are more on the clinical side of things that are kind of nice to know. Uh, think when your patient comes in, when you're first looking at your patient, our integumentary system really is our first insight into what is going on in that patient's body. So some examples of this, if someone is choking or if someone's struggling to get enough oxygen, they tend to have a blue color to their skin because their hemoglobin is not oxygenating. And so that would be a hint that they're not getting enough oxygen. Another example of this with liver failure would be jaundice. There's a lot of yellowing of the whites of the eyes and the skin because of the collection of waste products. And so that, again, that gives you an insight into that patient's liver function. So skin color on this side of things is all the normal stuff, but we can also think of skin color as our first insight into what may be wrong with our patient. Okay. Our dermis is a connective tissue with a whole bunch of fibers. So fibroblasts are going to be are immature cells that are laying down new fibers. Macrophages are part of our defense system. So macrophages can perform phagocytosis. That means they can eat up debris and bacteria. We're also going to have some fatty tissue. Most of that is going to be in the subcutaneous layer once we get below the dermis. We said this is our much thicker layer, and so it's going to give our skin a lot more strength. It's going to have our nerves, our blood vessels, our hair follicles. So the hair follicle is the pocket the hair sits in. It's not the hair itself. We'll have a smooth muscle that's associated with our hair. And we also find our glands, like our sweat glands and oil glands. And this is where our lymphatic vessels will also be contained along with our normal blood vessels. This is where really all the rest of our senses are located. So we have, like I said earlier, a lot of different types of sensory receptors for all our different types of sensations. And so we talked about Merkel cells that are up in the epidermis because there are superficial pressure and light touch, but everything else we would find down in the dermis. We have two layers of the dermis. The papillary layer is this superior layer, this top portion, and then we have the reticular layer, which is our deeper portion. So I pointed out these papilla earlier, and so our papillary layer is really kind of if we drew a line at the bottom of our hills all the way around. And then the much thicker, deeper layer is our reticular layer. And remember, for the skin, it's only our epidermis plus the dermis. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and take a quick break here because we just covered the epidermis and dermis. We'll talk about our accessory skin structures in this second half of things.